The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse, creating a rhythmic soundtrack to Vincent Moretti's solitary evening. At 42, he commanded an empire that stretched across 3 states, his name whispered in circles where power and darkness intersected. Yet, sitting in the leather chair overlooking the glittering cityscape, Vincent felt hollow, a sensation he'd become expertly trained to ignore. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother Marco. "Dad's asking for you again. He's not doing well." Vincent's jaw tightened. Their father, Salvatore, had been deteriorating for months, the doctors offering little hope. The old man had run the organization for 30 years before Vincent took over 5 years ago, transforming it into something more efficient, more calculated. But success meant nothing to a dying man surrounded by regrets. Vincent poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and stared at the photo on his desk, one of the few personal items he allowed himself. It showed a young woman holding an infant, both laughing at the camera. His mother, Isabella, and him, before everything fell apart. She'd left when he was 3 years old, just vanished. His father had raised him to believe she was dead, a ghost that shouldn't be mourned. But Vincent had always wondered. At age 7, he'd found old letters hidden in his father's office, letters from Isabella begging to see her son. Salvatore had burned them in front of him as punishment for snooping. That image, his mother's words turning to ash, had shaped Vincent into who he was, a man who trusted no one, who believed loyalty was currency purchased with violence and fear. His phone rang. Unknown number. Vincent almost didn't answer. But something, a whisper of intuition honed by decades of survival, made him pick up. "Is this Vincent Moretti?" A woman's voice, tentative and breathless. "Who wants to know?" "My name is Dr. Catherine Hayes. I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. I have a patient here, a woman named Isabella Romano. She was in a car accident this morning, and her emergency contact list contains your name. Are you—" Vincent's hand gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles went white. Isabella Romano. Not Isabella Moretti, but close enough. "I'll be there in 3 hours," he said, hanging up before the doctor could respond. He sat motionless for a moment, his mind refusing to process what he'd just heard. His mother, alive, after 39 years of silence. He walked to the window and stared at his reflection. A man with cold eyes and a scarred jaw, someone who'd been sculpted by violence and isolation. What would she think of the monster her son had become? For the first time in decades, Vincent Moretti felt afraid. Not of rival families or federal investigations or the 1,000 ways his enemies might try to destroy him. He was afraid of the woman lying in a hospital bed 3 hours away, afraid that the ghost from his past might finally prove real. The drive to Providence felt like traveling through a tunnel between worlds. Vincent's bodyguard, Tony, sat in the passenger seat of the black Mercedes, pretending not to notice his boss's unusual agitation. The usually composed crime boss had made the request himself, unusual enough to warrant attention, and now drummed his fingers against the steering wheel with an intensity that made even seasoned criminals nervous. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and desperation, a scent Vincent had encountered many times before, though never with his heart racing like this. Room 312. The nurse at the desk had been remarkably helpful once Vincent made a discreet phone call that transferred $50,000 to St. Mary's Emergency Fund. Money solved most problems in his experience. He stood outside the room for almost 2 minutes before entering, his hand on the doorframe, gathering the armor he wore so effortlessly in every other aspect of his life. The woman in the hospital bed was small. He hadn't expected that. She lay with her dark hair fanned across white pillows, bandages visible on her left arm and forehead. But her face, Vincent's breath caught. He recognized himself in the slope of her nose, the shape of her chin. She opened her eyes as if sensing his presence, Her irises were the same deep brown as his, flecked with gold in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Isabella's eyes widened, confusion giving way to something raw and profound. "Vincent," she whispered, and hearing his name from her lips felt like something fundamental shifting in his chest. He approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "How do you know my name?" he asked, though he already knew. "I followed your life from a distance," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "I have every newspaper clipping, every magazine article. I know you've become a powerful man in ways I never understood, but I had to know my son survived, had to know he—" She stopped, emotion rendering her speechless. Vincent pulled the chair close to her bed and sat, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "Why did you leave?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. "Your father," Isabella began, then paused, gathering strength. "He was a violent man, Vincent, not just in his business but at home. When I was pregnant with you, he nearly broke my arm during an argument about another woman. When you were born, I thought a child might change him, but it only made things worse. He saw your birth as weakness, as proof that I was trying to domesticate him." She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "One night, he was going to hurt you. You were 3, and he was drunk, angry about something, and he reached for you in ways that—" She didn't finish, but Vincent understood. "I made an impossible choice," Isabella continued. "I could stay and watch him destroy you, or I could leave and give you a chance to survive him. I left money, I left letters, but he kept you from me. He filled your head with lies about who I was. I've regretted every single moment of every single day since, but I don't regret saving your life." Vincent sat motionless. Everything he'd believed about his abandonment, everything his father had taught him about her, all of it rearranging itself in his mind like a puzzle, suddenly revealing its true image. "I'm not the man you think I am," Vincent said quietly. "I know," Isabella replied, "but you could be." Vincent arranged for Isabella to recover at his penthouse, hiring private nurses and specialists who ensured her comfort while keeping her isolated from the dangers that surrounded his world. She spent her first week healing in silence, and Vincent found himself creating excuses to visit her, checking on her recovery, sitting by her bedside during quiet evenings when he would normally be conducting business. It was during one of these visits that Marco arrived unannounced, his expression darkening when he found his brother sitting beside their newly discovered mother. "What the hell is this?" Marco demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. Vincent stood slowly. "Our mother is alive. She's been in Providence all these years." "Our mother is a lie that Dad protected us from," Marco shot back, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Isabella struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Your father told you I abandoned you both," she said gently. "But Marco, there's something you need to know. You weren't born when I left. Salvatore remarried after I disappeared. Your mother is a different woman, a good woman who loved you as her own. I had nothing to do with her death." The room fell into stunned silence. Marco's face cycled through disbelief, anger, then something that looked like understanding. He'd been 14 when his mother passed, and their father had barely acknowledged his grief. "Why didn't he tell me?" Marco's voice was small, almost childlike. "Because he couldn't face the complexity of the truth," Isabella answered. "Salvatore was a man who reduced everything to simple narratives of strength and weakness. He couldn't admit that he'd driven one woman away, or that he'd loved another enough to mourn her genuinely. It's easier to pretend the past never happened." Word of Isabella's existence spread through the Moretti organization like wildfire. Salvatore, still alive but confined to his bed, demanded Vincent explain this development. The confrontation happened in the master bedroom of the family estate in New Jersey, where the aging patriarch lay beneath silk sheets, his once powerful frame diminished by illness. "She's a trick," Salvatore spat, his voice rasping. "A con or a spy sent to weaken us. She's your wife, Vincent replied calmly, sitting at the foot of his father's bed. "And she never stopped loving you, though God knows you didn't deserve it." For the first time in his life, Vincent spoke the truth about his childhood. The loneliness, the manufactured grief, the way Salvatore had weaponized abandonment to forge him into an instrument of violence. Salvatore listened, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. When Vincent finished, the old man was silent for nearly 5 minutes. "I made mistakes," Salvatore finally whispered. "I was afraid of becoming like my own father, so I became someone worse." He turned his face to the wall. "She won't forgive me." "She already has," Vincent said. He brought Isabella to see her ex-husband the next day. She took Salvatore's weathered hand in her own, and they wept together, not for what they'd lost, but for what time had stolen and what they might have salvaged, had fear not consumed them both. It was during this visit that something shifted in Vincent. Watching his parents grieve their wasted years, he understood that power without connection was merely a beautiful prison. Salvatore Moretti's final morning arrived with the kind of cruel clarity that only terminal illness can deliver. The autumn sun streamed through the master bedroom windows of the New Jersey estate, illuminating dust motes that drifted like small ghosts above the mahogany furniture that had belonged to his family for generations. His breathing had become labored, a sound like wind moving through a broken window, and the doctors had stopped pretending that morphine was anything more than a courtesy to the dying. Vincent sat in the leather armchair positioned at the foot of his father's bed, the place he'd occupied for the past 72 hours without leaving. His bodyguard, Tony, had finally relented and allowed Isabella to remain in the adjacent sitting room. Though the old traditions died hard among the Moretti family, and many had questioned the propriety of allowing the abandoned wife to attend her ex-husband's deathbed. But Vincent had made it clear. What Salvatore would see at the end of his life would be truth, not the carefully constructed mythology he'd spent decades defending. The machines monitoring Salvatore's vital functions produced their electronic hymn, beeps that had become as familiar as Vincent's own heartbeat. His father's face, once scarred and powerful, had become a map of his own mortality, the skin paper-thin, the eyes sunken but still aware, still tracking movement in the room with an intensity that suggested the old man's mind remained sharp, even as his body surrendered to entropy. "Come closer," Salvatore whispered, his voice a rasp that barely carried across the few feet between them. Vincent rose and moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his hand hovering uncertainly before finally settling on his father's shoulder. In their world, physical affection had always been rare, reserved for moments of greeting or celebration. But this moment at the threshold seemed to demand something different. "I've been thinking about your mother," Salvatore continued, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the ceiling. "Not Isabella. My mother, your grandmother, Constance. You never knew her." Vincent remained silent. His father rarely spoke about his own parents. Salvatore's childhood had been treated as classified information, something too dangerous or too revealing to share even with his own son. "My father beat her," Salvatore said. "Every time he lost money at cards, every time business went wrong, every time he felt powerless, he came home and made her feel his rage. My mother bore it because she had nowhere else to go, because she had 3 sons who needed to eat, because in her time and place, that's what women did." His eyes shifted to Vincent's face. "I swore I would never be like him. I swore I would be strong, untouchable, a man who answered to no one and bowed to nothing. But in trying to escape becoming my father's victim, I became his mirror." Vincent felt the weight of revelation settling across his shoulders. "Isabella, your mother, she was trying to save you. Not from me, from becoming like me." Salvatore's breathing became more labored, and he paused for several minutes, gathering strength for the next sentence. "I've spent 40 years angry at a woman for doing the one merciful thing anyone did in this family. I punished you for her absence. I made you believe that loyalty demanded you understand my violence, that survival required you to become a predator. But look what it cost us. The love we could have had, the time we wasted, the years she spent wondering if you were alive, if you were safe. Vincent felt tears forming, something that happened so rarely he almost didn't recognize the sensation. "I'm not the man you tried to make me," he said quietly. "I know," Salvatore replied, and there was something almost like pride in his voice. "You've become better than me. You found your mother. You chose family over power. You chose redemption over revenge. That's what I should have done." The door to the sitting room opened, and Isabella appeared, her movements cautious, as if stepping into a space where she wasn't certain of her welcome. She'd aged in the weeks since the accident. The trauma of reunion, combined with the emotional exhaustion of confronting a man who'd erased her from history, had carved new lines into her face. But her eyes held the same warmth Vincent remembered from the photograph in his office, the same gentle strength that had somehow survived decades of separation and loss. "Salvatore," she said simply, approaching the bed with a grace that Vincent recognized he'd inherited from her. Salvatore reached toward her with a hand that trembled. Isabella took it in both of hers, and something ancient and painful seemed to pass between them. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Acceptance that their story, no matter how it had been rewritten or denied, had always been more than the ending either of them had chosen. "Tell him about his childhood," Salvatore said, looking at Vincent. "Tell him about the man I was before bitterness calcified my heart. Tell him about the night I danced with you in the kitchen, about the way you laughed when I lifted you onto my shoulders and you touched the chandelier." Isabella's hand tightened around Salvatore's. "Yes," she said, "I'll tell him." Marco arrived an hour before the end, his twin boys asleep in the car with their nanny, shielded from this particular ritual of family closure. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the tableau before him. His father, Isabella, and Vincent positioned around the bed like figures in a Renaissance painting, a composition of grace and sorrow that would have been impossible to imagine a month earlier. "He's asking for you," Vincent said. Marco moved to the bed and took his father's remaining hand. "I need you to know something," Salvatore said, addressing his younger son with an intensity that transcended physical weakness. "The man I became wasn't the man I wanted to be. The violence, the ruthlessness, the way I taught you that power meant isolation, it was all fear masquerading as strength. If you have even a moment to make a different choice than the one I made, take it. Don't spend your life proving you're not weak by becoming a monster." The hours that followed were marked by silence more than by words. Salvatore's breathing gradually slowed, his consciousness drifting between present and past, reality and memory. He spoke sometimes in Italian, phrases that Isabella translated for Vincent and Marco, prayers his mother had taught him, love songs he'd sung on the night he met his first wife, the names of men he'd hurt spoken with a regret that seemed to come from someplace deeper than his disease. As the sun descended and the room filled with the particular quality of autumn twilight, Salvatore's eyes fixed on Isabella. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely audible. "I see that now. I was afraid of the life you represented, the normalcy, the kindness, the possibility of being something other than what my father made me. So I chose the man I thought I had to be, and I lost everything that mattered." Isabella leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "You didn't lose everything," she said. "You have 2 sons, you have a daughter-in-law, you have grandchildren who will grow up knowing that even when people make mistakes, they can choose to change. You gave them that gift, Salvatore. That's not nothing." Salvatore died at 9:47 p.m., with Isabella holding one hand and Vincent holding the other. Marco sat in the armchair, his face wet with tears, understanding in that moment that he was grieving not just his father's death, but all the possibilities his father had refused to live. The funeral arrangements began the following morning. 300 people attended, associates, employees, people from legitimate businesses intertwined with criminal enterprises. But the most important moment happened before the service began, in a small chapel where the immediate family gathered. Vincent stood before the closed casket, his voice steady as he spoke. My father was a man shaped by circumstances and choices, neither of which he fully controlled. He was a victim of violence who became perpetrator of violence. He abandoned love because he was afraid of its power. But in his final days, he found redemption in the people he'd hurt. He chose to speak truth about his failures. He chose to support my attempts to chart a different course. That's the father I'm choosing to remember. Isabella added her own words. Salvatore was my first love, and though we were separated by his own choices and fears, that love never fully died. I saw in him the capacity for goodness that his circumstances tried to destroy. I forgive him, not because forgetting the pain is necessary, but because holding on to anger would mean giving him power over my remaining years. I choose instead to honor the man he could have been and celebrate the man his sons are becoming. Over the subsequent months and years, the transformation of the Moretti organization accelerated. Vincent systematically liquidated the most overtly criminal enterprises, converting capital into legitimate ventures. The construction company that had previously served as a money laundering operation became genuinely profitable. The shipping business that had moved contraband now moved only legal goods. The restaurants and hotels that had served as fronts became genuine hospitality ventures. It was a delicate process. There were associates who resisted, who saw Vincent's changes as weakness and attempted to challenge his authority. Those challenges were resolved, though Vincent was careful to ensure they were resolved through economic leverage and political pressure rather than violence. When enforcement became necessary, he outsourced it to people outside the family, compartmentalizing his past from his present. Marco became increasingly involved in the legitimate businesses, eventually taking full control of the New Jersey operations as they transitioned away from organized crime. He used the therapy he'd begun to process his childhood to become a better father to his own sons, involving them in his business decisions, teaching them not through violence and fear, but through mentorship and example. Vincent's relationship with Elena deepened, and they married in a small ceremony in Manhattan, with Isabella serving as a witness. Lucia became a big sister to two younger children, all three growing up in households where family dinners meant actual conversation rather than displays of power, where decisions were made through discussion rather than decree. Isabella became the emotional center of the family, not just through blood, but through presence. She opened a small Italian restaurant in Manhattan named Constance, after her own mother-in-law, a woman she'd never met but whose story Salvatore had entrusted to his children. The restaurant became a gathering place where family members congregated, where loyal associates were welcomed, where the transition from old ways to new ways was negotiated over pasta and wine. It was in the kitchen of Constance one evening that Lucia, now 8 years old, asked her grandmother why her family had been so angry for so long. Isabella, stirring marinara sauce while Lucia sat on a stool beside her, smiled at the innocence of the question. Sometimes, she said, people become so busy protecting themselves that they forget what they're protecting themselves for. Your father, your grandfather, all of us in our way, we built walls instead of bridges. It took us a long time to understand that the strongest thing we could do was tear those walls down and let people close to us. It took us far too long, actually. That's why I want to tell you something important, something I want you to remember your whole life. Lucia looked up at her grandmother, the wooden spoon pausing in the sauce. Love is not weakness, Isabella said. Choosing family is not surrender. Opening your heart is not the same as being vulnerable to destruction. These are acts of courage that take far more strength than anything your great-grandfather taught or anything your grandfather learned to do. You understand? Lucia nodded solemnly, absorbing the wisdom in a way that only children could. not intellectually but intuitively, understanding that her grandmother was speaking about something that mattered beyond words. The evening light caught the gold flecks in both their brown eyes, a genetic inheritance that connected them across generations to Salvatore, to the father and son who had been shaped by violence, to the woman who had chosen love despite everything urging her toward bitterness. In that moment, stirring sauce in a kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and basil, the Moretti family was finally becoming something different than what circumstance and choice had made them. They were becoming human again, flawed, complex, but fundamentally oriented toward healing rather than toward harm. They were becoming a family, not a criminal enterprise. And perhaps that was the greatest redemption any of them could achieve. Not erasing the past, not denying the harm they'd caused, but building something genuine from the ruins of what their worst selves had created. The story of Salvatore Moretti didn't end with forgiveness, because some harms are too deep to be fully forgiven. But it ended with possibility, the possibility that even people shaped by darkness could choose light. Even people trained in violence could choose peace. Even people who had spent decades believing themselves monsters could discover in their final days that humanity was always available to them if they chose it. And in the hands of his sons, that possibility became something more than a deathbed revelation. It became a legacy that would outlast the criminal empire Salvatore had built. A redemption story that would echo through generations, proving that the power to change is never truly lost, no matter how far one has traveled into darkness.